This episode of the Driving Safety Show is sponsored by Drivers Alert, celebrating 30 years of helping companies keep their drivers safe. To learn more, visit driversalert.com. Distracted driving, drunk driving, drowsy driving. You want safer roads, and so do we. You're listening to the Driving Safety Show. Hear insights, in-depth analysis, and expert advice from key players in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors who are leading the way in making our roads safer. Are you ready to join us? And now, your host of the Driving Safety Show, Rich Sordahl.
Welcome to another episode of the Driving Safety Show. Today's guest has served in law enforcement in the Silicon Valley area for more than 20 years. Over his career in public safety, his assignments have included SWAT, crisis negotiation, vice, narcotics, surveillance, terrorism and intelligence, and officer training. He has been a police sergeant, incident commander, and lead instructor, and has received numerous awards for training excellence, including the Bronze Level Training Award by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He is also the founder of Savage Training Group, where he helps police officers advance their careers, become experts, and save lives. The company's flagship course is Response Tactics for Critical Incidents and In-Progress Crimes, designed to show officers and supervisors how to cut through the confusion and respond to critical incidents safely, calmly, and methodically. It is an honor to welcome Scott Savage to the show. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rich.
So your bio, it's so incredibly extensive. I mean, we could continue to go on and on and on. And the one thing a couple things that stood out to me was, one, you seem to really have this love for education and training and development. And the second piece of it is your strong interest in crisis management. Maybe you could speak to that and how you got there.
Well, this is pretty much what I've been doing in my adult life. So I became an emergency medical technician at age 19. I became a licensed paramedic here in California at 23, which is frightening to think back that I was the one showing up at 23 years old to your medical emergency. But then I became a cop, just a couple years after that. And this is going on 20 years in law enforcement. So this is literally what I've grown up doing. And it's always interests me. When I was younger, I didn't have, posters on the wall of sports figures. I was more enamored when the fire truck went by. And I just looked at them, wow, that's incredible. Or one time a cop came to our house for something, I don't know what it was. And I just thought, oh, this is cool, And so now kind of growing up and doing those jobs has just been, amazing. And the crisis management piece has really been what's excited me. It's what I think is fun. Once you do this for a long period of time, you really enjoy the emergency aspect of it because it's got some gravity to it. It really matters, if you get it right, you feel like you accomplished something. And then the training aspect has just been my way to kind of help, right? I watch the same videos, the same viral videos that you and everyone else do of cops making poor decisions and getting in over their heads or getting into some situations. And I look at those and go, man, I think a lot of those are training issues. And I don't know that we necessarily as law enforcement need more training. I think we need better training. And so starting my training company, the Savage Training Group, and being involved with training law enforcement officers is honestly my way of addressing that and giving back. Yeah.
And you mentioned about starting out as an EMT and a paramedic. So your entire career has been focused on this first responder mindset. So, and I imagine, like you mentioned too, you're being a first responder. Those critical first few moments determine, in many cases, between life and death, or someone becoming, permanently disabled, or whatever the case might be. So there's such a importance placed on critical decision making in a quick, timely fashion, right?
Yeah. And I think maybe one of the downfalls we have as a profession in law enforcement is that we often train young police officers how to do things. So we teach them, how to use their baton to hit something. We teach them how to drive fast, hopefully safely. We teach them how to run after someone. And I think that kind of the missing piece of the puzzle is when. why to do those things. Asking ourselves is, tactically, I understand we can do this, but strategically, should we be doing this? You know, is this the right time to do X? And that's really the magical part of training. It's the why behind what we're doing. Um, as far as can the first officers who are arriving on scene make an impact, or their decision making have consequence rather, we tell police officers, listen, the decisions you make in those first few seconds of an emergency, something as simple as whether you decided to arrive on scene and jump in the middle of the fray, that can actually dictate how everything else is going to go. And I'll give you an example of that. Some crazy thing has happened in a house, man with a gun doing crazy things inside of his house. If that first young copper that is rolling up on the scene parks in front of the house and runs in, to kind of play Superman, well, the second, third, fourth, fifth, and everyone else who's coming is going to be, well, I guess we're all going in. I guess we're going in to help Junior now, who's gotten in way over his head. We don't have much of a choice anymore. So that little thing, like just deciding, should I engage right now, that can actually set the stage for everything else we wanted to do. All the great planning and all the special teams we were going to bring in, all the cool tactical stuff we are going to do, that goes out the window because Junior ran in the house. So we just try to impress upon officers, man, those decisions you make can have far, far reaching consequence.
Now, your flagship course I mentioned on critical incidents, it's a California post certified course. Maybe you can help us understand, what does that exactly mean?
Flagship course is called Response Tactics for Critical Incidents and In-Progress Crimes. That's a long title for a pretty darn concise class. It's like a one-day basic critical incident response course for officers and supervisors, really teaching them how to be safe, methodical, respond to those kind of hot calls, right? So like a burglary in progress, a robbery in progress, the barricaded suspect. The course is California Post Certified. Post stands for Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. That is the California sort of certifying entity that reviews police training courses and gives it either a stamp of approval or not. Practically speaking, it gives kind of an air of legitimacy, right, to training courses when agencies are looking around saying, should we send our people to this course or not? They're probably not going to certify like a underwater knife fighting school, right? But they're going to certify something that's maybe a little bit more well thought out and sophisticated, hopefully.
And I guess what really interested me in hearing some of your insights, most of our audience, of course, is not going to be law enforcement, but the common piece here is just when there is a crisis and some kind of emergency takes place. In our case, it could be a safety manager is at a refinery, let's say in the Galveston, Texas area, and there's a fire. What are the steps that they take? There's chaos, there's lots of pandemonium. How do they handle that? There could be an HR team out there who's thinking about active shooter situations and going through the process of planning and preparing in case something does happen. And some of the same processes are engaged when they're thinking about how to plan and prepare for this, just like an officer would be handling an incident where you're learning you arrive at a scene and everything's new, right? Information is, you're getting conflicting pieces of information. So I'm sure you come across this quite often yourself, where you find these common themes, and people in industry probably are reaching out to you too and saying, hey, maybe you can help us give some insights so we can prepare better or plan better.
Man, yeah, that's a broad topic and a tough, cookie to crack, especially if it's not something you're having to think about every day. If you're a crisis manager or an HR professional at an entity, hopefully that's not something you got to think about every day. But when you do, what a broad topic. And my fear is that there would be, training organizations or companies ready to sell you something, right? Ready to sell you some big expensive package. And I don't know that you necessarily need that. I think there's some simple concepts you could probably take away from what we do in a law enforcement crisis management world that might have some impact. I think the first thing to take away is the training component. And money for training, money for security, money for crisis management isn't always on the top of a private company's budget list. But I think it's real important, and it doesn't have to be some elaborate, super expensive, exercise. It could be some pretty simple things. Give you an example, like a great mantra. You mentioned the active shooter. A great mantra to think about if you find yourself involved in an active shooter situation is that run, hide, defend. Run, hide, defend. That's pretty popular mantra. I don't know who developed it, and maybe there's something better, but that one sounds pretty good to me. And if you're going to have to run, hide, and defend, I immediately think about, okay, um, is Susie who and Joe that are sitting at their desk, are they comfortable with getting up and running right now? Running out the building, because I can guarantee they're going to think like, wait a minute, like, is this really an emergency? Maybe it's just fireworks. Maybe it's just this. I don't want to be embarrassed, and I certainly don't want to be that guy that ran out of the office that one time and everyone calls me a chicken and I was wrong. And so you're going to have to push past some of those natural human embarrassment, icky kind of factors. Go exercise it. you know Hey, everybody, in 1 minute we're all going to get up and run 50% speed, don't get anybody hurt, out the building. And let's do that a couple of times. Let's just get used to that, right? We can all be the weirdos that ran out. Let's normalize some of that behavior. And then it's really practicing. Okay, if I had to run out of this building right now, which couple ways could I go? If I couldn't do that and I had to hide, where would I hide, specifically? And if I had to defend, meaning, yikes, we couldn't run, we couldn't hide, and I've got to defend myself, what would that look like? Can I walk myself through the motions? Can I visualize myself throwing something at somebody, or you know, trying to hit them with a fire extinguisher or something like that? Really starting to exercise that, visualize it, talk about it, normalize those things. And we have to do that for law enforcement, right? That's not something we deal with every day. We're not going to an active shooter every day. That's a once in a career, if ever, kind of event. It makes the news because it honestly doesn't happen a lot. If you think about how many, cities there are in the U.S. and whatnot, it doesn't happen a lot. So we have to normalize those behaviors and convince police officers to make that switch quickly as well.
So when it comes to crisis management in general, obviously your position, I guess, is training is a big part of it. But what would be one of the first steps someone would take to at least get prepared for a crisis? How do you approach that? Is it more of a mental, like a general procedural thing, or because like you said, there's so many different scenarios you can't plan for every particular one, especially if you're a company.
I would say you want to figure out the risks, right? So then you want to figure out the frequency and severity of those risks, meaning how often, how probable rather, is this to happen? And if it did happen, what's the severity, right? So we're out here, I'm out here in California. Probably don't need to do a lot of planning about hurricanes and tornadoes versus you're in Florida. That one of those two, I forget which one it is, maybe both, you need to concern yourself with. But out here, we need to concern ourselves with earthquakes. So I think it's understanding which one I'm most likely to kind of face and pick the top, ones that seem high frequency, or if they're low frequency, high severity. But if you've got a low frequency, low severity kind of thing that I don't think this is really going to happen too often, maybe we don't need to worry about that as much. So what I would probably recommend is an exercise that we use with law enforcement officers to help develop contingency plans. And the exercise is called a pre-mortem, right? A pre-mortem, kind of like a post-mortem, but just a little bit different. Everybody knows what a post-mortem is. That's the investigation that's done after someone dies, after something has gone obviously wrong. We do an after-action report and figure out what went wrong and how can we avoid it in the future. The pre-mortem is what we're taking advantage of ahead of time, right? Let's decide on all the bad things that could go wrong here. If I'm a crisis manager of a company, I think, what's the worst thing that could happen here? Well, an active shooter, a fire, workplace violence, those types of stuff. All right. And what's the risk? What's the real issue with that? Well, people could get hurt. Okay. Now, using a pre-mortem, what are all the factors that would have to be in place for those things to occur? Active shooter is a great example. Out here in Silicon Valley, a lot of our companies embrace this open sort of concept with their campuses, open buildings, open floor plans, very, very welcoming to the community and collaboration, and all that's great. Obviously, though, it would lend itself to a bad person sort of walking onto the campus and wreaking havoc. So if there's a way to lock the exterior doors, put some just physical barriers between bad guy who is outside and wants to come in, that's step one. Okay, so using the pre-mortem example, if we have an active shooter, that's something we're going to face. What are all the factors that have to be in place? Well, you'd have to get to us, find us, shoot us. Okay, so if he can't get to us, let's address that. And if he does get to us, he can't find us. Okay, let's put some something in place to address that. So I think that's a way of kind of just quickly determining what we should be focusing on. We use that in the law enforcement world. We say, hey, listen, let's say you're going to a barricaded suspect. There's a man with a gun inside a house, crazy person. What are all the bad things that could happen? Well, he could shoot us, shoot the cops. He could shoot himself. He could escape and shoot other people. Okay, you mentioned shooting a cop. What are all the factors that would have to be in place for that to happen? Well, I guess he'd have to see us first. We'd have to be close enough to be within an effective range of his weapon. Right. So now it's starting to naturally expose. So how do we deal with that? Well, don't let him see us and don't be close enough for him to shoot us. Right. So that kind of pre-mortem thinking just helps to naturally expose contingency plans, naturally expose how we should shape our response to things. So I think that, that might be helpful to crisis managers.
So in law enforcement, I guess when you're talking about crisis management, a lot of this is really quick, critical reasoning. You're having to, I mean, there's training that goes into this, but then you're going through this decision tree process of, like you're mentioning, well, what does it take for them to shoot an officer? Well, first they have to see us. And so you're going through these rapid decision tree processes to get to what next.
Yeah. And we teach a sort of a basic framework, critical response concept that we teach officers and supervisors to kind of overlay over any sort of crisis they're responding to. And what we've found is that, whether it's a simple kind of call, like a woman calls and says, there's a guy in my backyard at night and he's prowling out there. That's kind of on the lower end. Or it's a freaking terrorist attack, something huge and dramatic. There's a lot of concepts that we can put in place that seem to be relevant to all of those, right? So like the concepts we teach is a sort of a multi-step procedure. The first thing that we teach police officers and supervisors to do is designate or decide on an officer in charge, an OIC. And that means designate a leader. That means somebody be in charge. A lot of your listeners might be familiar with the incident command system that was developed, I think, by wildland firefighters in California back in the 70s or so, based on some military models. And I always tell people, it's the designator is incident commander, not incident commanders. There's no S on the end. This means somebody, one person has to be in charge. And I think in a crisis response, simply designating someone and saying, hey, I'm in charge. Everybody kind of follow me on this one. Having rehearsed that, having trained that person, that's naturally going to lead to a harmonious response. Everything else will kind of start to fall in place. And so what are the roles, of that officer in charge? That person sets the priorities, decides on the mission, what we're trying to accomplish here. They divvy up responsibilities, and that piece is huge. We often find in law enforcement responses is that every cop knows the best thing to do. Just ask them, right? Everybody kind of wants to do their own thing. They've decided what to do, and cops aren't used to working together. That might come as a shock to people. We drive around in our own cars, doing our own thing, making our own car stops. We don't do much team stuff. But then when we arrive on scene to all work together on some big incident, it's kind of the first time we need to work as a team, have a leader, and sort of follow their lead. The fire department, totally opposite. They're always working as a team. They're constantly used to everybody has a designated role. There's one person in charge, and it's a nice orderly flow. That's something we could really, learn from the fire service. But that OIC, that officer in charge in our world, like I mentioned, sets the priorities, divvies up responsibilities. And here's the biggest takeaway. They maintain the 10,000-foot view. They maintain the global perspective, the overall perspective on this thing. If you're in charge of a crisis, you want to remove yourself one or two steps away from the chaos. Take that big picture view of what's going on. The minute your head is down and you're involved in doing a minor task that you could have delegated to somebody else, that you lose big picture focus, right? And anytime you yourself are in physical danger, you're trying to run the show, but you yourself is facing the active shooter, you yourself might get burned by the fire. It naturally doesn't lead to good decision making, right? Starts getting that emotional fight or flight response. That's why we teach law enforcement incident commanders, hey, take a step back. Go out to your command vehicle down the street, right? That's where you belong, Sergeant. You don't belong up close and personal to whatever the threat is. We have officers that can deal with that. We want you to be a little bit more removed, more cold, more analytical, more big picture kind of thinking. It just naturally leads to better decision making.
So when you're talking about taking the leadership aspect, taking charge of a particular situation, and I think we talked a little bit about this offline too. Obviously in law enforcement, police officers come under continuous scrutiny for every decision that's made, whether it's a no decision or a decision. And there's really no other profession that has that level of scrutiny. But taking that same concept and maybe thinking about in private industry, somebody's trying to figure out how they're going to plan for, let's say in South Florida, a hurricane, or maybe there could be an explosion at a refinery or a chemical plant. Why do you think there are times when people don't want to take that leadership role? Is it psychological? Is it fear for that's responsibility could come with repercussions, or there's liability? I mean, what are some ways to overcome this and come up with a solution for somebody who obviously needs to take charge, because you have to have a leader in a situation like that?
Man, that's a great question. If my gut is telling me that it's probably all those reasons, and I think there's fear of physical danger, right, of whatever the emergency is, but also fear of career damage, fear of what will they say. A lot of crisis managers and people that are in this work are kind of the worrywarts, right? They're the people that are always saying, hey, we got to worry about this, we got to think about that, safety. And those people tend to get marginalized. It's like, oh, there goes Rich again, and Rich is always talking about, oh, the risks and the hurricanes. Oh, Rich, give it a break, And so Rich is used to getting marginalized. Rich is used to people kind of, rolling their eyes at him. So when it's the big one and it's time for Rich to speak up and do his thing, he's a little gun shy. He's a little gun shy because it's not celebrated on a day-to-day basis. And we face the same thing. We face the same thing in law enforcement. In law enforcement, it's kind of cool to be nonchalant. It's kind of cool to be like, hey, this isn't a big deal. I'll just handle this myself. You get cool points for that. But it's not safe. People have been hurt by getting cool points. The tombstone courage is what we call it. Like, oh, I'll just handle this myself. It's one of the main reasons law enforcement officers get killed. So it's deadly serious, this question. And I think we need to start celebrating people that take a leadership role. Probably comes back to training, probably comes back to exercising this. Okay, when we do have this emergency happen, this is who's going to be in charge. We're all going to listen to him, and he's, going to lead us in how to do what we need to do. Back to that, let's practice, let's rehearse, let's normalize, right? Normalize this behavior. And I always think back to fire alarm drills in schools. I live across the street from a school, and I hear that they do their drill. It's got to be once a month. It has to be. And I think, when's the last time a child died in a school fire? I think it's been decades. This is a good thing. I'm not complaining, but that's a very normalized behavior. Those children, I imagine, aren't petrified about a fire and go home and have a meltdown about it. It's just something they do. Oh, it's the fire alarm. They go out, they stand out in the field, and then 10 minutes later, they get to go back inside. Let's start normalizing some of these other things, putting those industrial practices in place for schools, businesses, law enforcement. Let's just get used to these types of stuff and push past that hump, because um, we could start to normalize that behavior where that fear is lessened about assuming that leadership role. Um, in law enforcement, we deal with the same thing everyone deals with, the group think mentality. Let's all just kind of work on this together. That way, no one's really responsible for if it goes wrong. But if it goes right, I was in charge. But if it goes wrong, kind of we were all just doing the best we can. You kind of need to push past that if you're going to be in crisis response. It's easy for me because this is all I've ever done. Since a young man, I had to be the guy to be like, hey, this is an emergency. Let's do this. And so I've gotten used to it, comfortable with it. I enjoy it, but I understand. And I remember those feelings when I started out doing it, just that uncertainty. But something that helped me is somebody told me it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to be not make perfect decisions, because you're only human and you're bound by human performance capability. You're bound by imperfect information coming in is naturally going to lead to imperfect information coming out. So that's helped me to kind of push past that.
Yeah, I think and you touched on it, I think a little bit earlier too, where humans are such creatures of habit, and say there is an active shooter in your company office, and for a few seconds you're kind of looking around, you're looking at each other, and you're thinking, yeah, this has got to be a joke. You oftentimes you hear people say, oh, I thought it was firecrackers, fireworks, or something of that nature, and so you're kind of, because you're not used to something like that, so it's taking some time to process. I think about a time when I was driving on a divided highway in Texas, and I saw a car coming on the wrong side, coming right at me. And again, it took me like 3 seconds to kind of think, do I really need to veer off the road and slow down?
Yeah.
I mean, because you're so not used to seeing something like that, and it's almost like it's psychological. You're just not trained to see that.
That's a great point. And you just made me think of maybe what we should do is put triggers in place. Okay. And so the active shooter in the building, let's all decide in our office here that if this and this happen, we're going to assume it's an active shooter, and we're going to do our active shooter protocol. Let's not do a training where the guy walks in the mask and, oh, I'm the active shooter and I've got this fakey rifle. Yeah, everybody knows what, that'll be the active shooter. Let's do something that's real life. Let's just make a kind of a big, loud, syncopated bang in another room and a scream, you know, and let's decide if we hear, one of these 5 things, we're all going to assume it's active shooter and run, hide, defend. Let's put those triggers in place, because in real life, it's not scenario land. In the academy, when I went to the police academy back in 1999, we would train in silos. They'd say, Scott, this is the domestic violence scenario. Scott, this is the stabbing scenario. Scott, this is the car stop scenario. In the domestic violence scenario, we would have an actress or a poor actress, some off-duty cop walk out, and she would say, "Oh, my head hurts. I am the wife, and my husband just hit me." And he would be there angry. Oh, just spoon feeding. And so as young officers, we train, okay, when I see this very, very obvious thing, then I'll know it, that's what to do. But in real life, it's all mashed up. Everything's mashed up. The first aid training, the shooting training, the driving fast training, all of it just gets mashed up into one thing. And that's why it's hard for cops fresh out of the academy to kind of adjust to, real life. So maybe we just need to train in concepts. If you see these things, it probably means this, and maybe that'll help push us past the vague kind of gray area that things are going to happen in. Because, I think as a law enforcement officer, as I'm driving around in my patrol car, when that call comes out of the active shooter at school, I've already decided I bet it won't come out initially on the radio as active shooter at this high school. It's going to come out as an unknown situation. We're getting multiple 911 calls reporting some kind of disturbance. and we're going to have to go, oh man, this is very unusual. I bet this is, some major emergency. Let's put some things in place. Let's start getting all the resources we need there quickly, because this has the potential. It's got trigger 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, good enough. If it, what they say, like it sounds like it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck until proven otherwise. Let's just get there. And then if it turns out, hey, it wasn't a duck, it wasn't an active shooter, no harm, no foul, we can slow everything down.
Well, and that also brings up another interesting question. So in law enforcement, you're dealing with this all the time when there is a crisis that's developing, is just this lack of intelligence, this information. And someone who's in private industry could also, they can, it resonates with them when they're thinking about, okay, initially the first couple of minutes, we don't have all the information. It's imperfect information. And so how do you deal with a serious critical incident, or how do you approach it when you still know you don't have all the information and you have to be cautious, but at the same time, you have to neutralize whatever the threat might be if you're, let's say, in law enforcement?
Yeah, I would decide ahead of time on some kind of decision-making methodology, or some trigger, some funnel that you want to go through real quick in your head. And we teach officers after we teach them, hey, designate an officer in charge. Next step is control the response, meaning let's make sure it's not inadequate or an over response. And that next step is our first decision. And we teach officers to make a quick decision whether to stabilize or neutralize. Stabilize, neutralize. And to do that, to neutralize the threat, to actually quickly rush in to try to stop whatever's happening right now, it's only in a very narrow set of circumstances. And that is either an active shooting, or more correctly, an active killing, right? Because it could be a knife, a chainsaw, whatever, or someone who's in imminent peril. I think of, someone who is peril, not just danger, not two guys fist fighting in a bar, but true peril. If those things, active killing, or imminent peril, are occurring, rush in and neutralize the threat. Close distance with the aggressor. Try to neutralize that, because it's time and time again, statistically has shown, if we just rush to contact and then engage the shooter in an active shooter situation, we can stop the killing, right? So if I'm in private industry and I'm a security professional or a crisis manager of some kind, I'd be thinking about what is my triggers? What are my top things that if this is occurring, I would have to act truly immediately? Active shooter, unfortunately, is one. I'm sure there's others, right? It could even be something like, hey, if I ever get the report that, I own a trucking company, and if I ever get the report, someone says, hey, one of the drivers is drunk. He showed up to work drunk and he's about to get in the truck. Okay, stop everything. That might be a trigger for me right now. Stop everything. We'll figure out if he's drunk. We'll figure out what we're going to do with him, disciplinary, all that stuff later. Right now, just he needs to not be driving. Is he in the truck? Where is he? Who's got the keys? Let's just immediately address that. Stop everything else right now. Because if a drunk employee gets in that truck and drives, that's going to be a million times worse. We need to contain that problem, right? In law enforcement, we teach, hey, is it an active shooter? No. Is there imminent peril? No. There's one more time we need to act super quickly, and that is a fleeing suspect. Meaning we don't need to rush in to try to find him, but we need to rush to try to contain, to send police officers to strategic locations to develop a perimeter around wherever we believe the suspect is. Because if we waited 10, 15 minutes to set a perimeter, the guy can get pretty far in 10, 15 minutes. So I would just think, like, what are my emergencies? I suppose it could be a brand emergency. If this is ever occurring, one of my employees is going sideways on social media talking about the brand or something like that, I need to kind of cut that right now. Or I'm sure there's a million different things you could come up with, but decide that stuff ahead of time. These are kind of the top 5 things I would need to take immediate action. Everything else isn't an emergency. Could be urgent, could be pressing. It's just not a true emergency.
And before the interview, we were talking about this one thing that was interesting to me, this crisis response box that you talked about, where, whether, active shooter is obviously a popular topic today, but it could be anything where there's an emergency where buddy in law enforcement or first responders in general need access to a facility. And you'd mentioned how something as simple as just being able to open a door and get inside to that facility can be a hamper just because first responder doesn't have access to a key card or some access point to that building.
Yeah, let's do two things. I want to tell you my experiences of arriving at the scene of, businesses, right, where there's an emergency developing. Having been a law enforcement officer for 20 years, I'll tell you about my experiences and frustrations and how we can fix that. And then the second thing is maybe in the show notes or if we can somehow to your audience get that PDF about the crisis response boxes so they can just have something to kind of take with them. My experience on going to businesses where there's emergencies happening is we generally face two problems. The issue is the location within the business where it's actually occurring. It doesn't matter if it's a small building, that wouldn't be an issue, but in these large, expansive private industry complexes, especially out here in Silicon Valley where we have all these major companies, the footprint of a company like Intel or HP or Google is enormous, and simply arriving at the street address, we could be 20 minutes, away from finding the actual problem, which is hidden in building 7, room 2, floor 8, that kind of thing. So location is the huge issue for us. The second thing is access, is access. And in an emergency, say an active shooter, if we come up against a locked door, think about the average locked door construction in an industrial building of some kind or a commercial grade building. Heavy wooden, sometimes metal doors with locking mechanisms. Those aren't easy to get through. And as law enforcement officers, we may, if we grabbed it, be carrying some entry, some breaching, some forcible entry type of gear with us, but oftentimes not. So now we're sitting and we can't deal with the emergency simply because we can't get past a locked door. Isn't that incredible? I think it was the Virginia Tech shooting that happened many, many years ago where the officers couldn't get into the building, Something as simple as that. So using that pre-mortem, those are the things I just told you that can go wrong. Well, how do we fix that? Somebody needs to meet the officers when they arrive and tell them where specifically it is and how to get to whatever's happening, and then provide them access to it. So is that a key card? Is it safe to send an employee with the officers to open, the area for them? And pro tip, the officers aren't going to be all arriving at once. The fire department's not going to be all arriving at once. It's going to be coming in waves. So that means we need multiple people to flag down the cops and bring them to the right location. A great way to kind of pre-plan for this that won't cost you a lot, just have to put some security measures in place, is that crisis response box mentality. I didn't invent it. I think it was invented for the educational system, but it is a box full of maps and some floor plans and some keys. That's the real basic box. If you want to get fancy and put a personnel accountability form with some cell phones to the major people that need contact in there, great. If you want to get fancy and stage a few of those in different locations around your campus because you can't get to them, super. We had a company in a town that I used to police where they locked it in heavy grade boxes that were all hard to break into, and they had it out in the parking lot, bolted into some poles with an alarm on it. And so that way they figured, hey, if we're all running out, we're not sticking around in this building, you cops can go over there and access this box that's out there. We'll open it for you. And then you guys can go in there and deal with that. I thought that was, smart. So something as simple as that, just being able to tell the cops, this is specifically where it's happening, and here's how to get there. Man, you'd be ahead of almost, I would say, 95% of the businesses I've ever been to in 20 years of policing, just by doing that, creating a crisis response box.
So Scott, on your company, Savage Training Group, why did you start the company, and what is kind of the mission or the focus?
Well, our tagline talks about we want to give police officers the best possible training, right, to help them advance their careers and save lives, and that's the mission, right? There is a lot of training out there that just doesn't really meet the sophistication level, doesn't meet the mark of what our officers need, and that's something everybody can agree on, right? The most staunch police critic, right, our least fan in the world, would agree that cops need good training, and everybody agrees on that. Cops agree on that. Our fans, our critics, everybody agrees on that. And so I think it's so important, and something I want to be involved with. What we do at Savage Training Group is just a little bit different than what other people do. Is we use expert teachers. We use law enforcement officers who are also expert instructors. They know how to guide the class. They know how to reach the students. They understand advanced learning techniques, advanced teaching techniques. It would be the antithesis of the old teacher that sits out there clicking through that PowerPoint, right? He's on slide 4, and it's at the bottom. It says there's 400 slides, and you're like, kill me now. We've all been to that class, and we're just like, I don't care what this person says. I just want to die, right? That is the complaint that so many law enforcement officers have said about law enforcement training. So we try to make this something a little bit more engaging, a little bit something a little bit more fun. If we can have fun doing it, cops, and adults like learning like that. The reason that people hate death by PowerPoint, that's the term, death by PowerPoint. The reason people hate PowerPoint so much isn't PowerPoint. It's not the good people at Microsoft. It has nothing to do with their product. It's just sitting and listening. Sitting back and listening is the lowest form of learning, they say. That Bloom's taxonomy of learning, that's a teaching thing, says that the studies have shown sitting back and listening and memorizing, remembering, it's a pretty low form of learning. You're not engaged. And so if we can get you as an adult to analyze, create, solve a problem, those are types of things that people go, ooh, I like that. I like kind of working through those types of issues. So in our training courses, that's what we have strived to do. It's been successful. People dig it. So that's the number one thing. People let you know when they're signing up for multiple classes or when they're giving us great evaluations. That's how you know, hey, we're on to something here.
So your approach to learning and development, it sounds like you're using scenario-based training and problem solving. I think you mentioned offline that you come up with different scenarios and you keep probing and keep asking. And so you're challenging the people in the class to think about other creative solutions to problems.
Yeah, that's how we encourage growth, encourage actual learning, encourage people to be involved. I'll give you an example, and this is a hot button issue in law enforcement. This is something that there's so many arguments back and forth. And in California, there was just a great news article in the LA Times about this topic, and it's controversial. We in law enforcement often have to deal with the mentally ill in crisis, right? We have to deal with a person who's mentally ill, perhaps not taking their medications. They're in their house. They're suicidal. Perhaps they're armed. And somehow the cops have been notified, right? Maybe it's a family who says, you got to get in there and help my loved one. They are suicidal. They're in their house. They're alone. They need help. Naturally, they call the police. We respond. In years past, we would try to negotiate the person out. And when they didn't come out, we would make entry into their house. But because they were armed, we'd have our guns drawn, and picture that. The cops are coming in, busting in the guy's house, saying things like, we're here to save you, as we've got our guns on him for our protection. And unfortunately, tragically, year after year, that resulted in those people being killed by the police, those people killing police officers, violence. So as a profession, we've started to develop different ways of dealing with that. Maybe we should disengage. Maybe there isn't a safe way of going in that house and dealing with that person. Perhaps we should leave, right? Law enforcement officers, we should just leave. If we can't do it safely, perhaps we are not able to do it safe or not able to do it at all. And the act now of police officers, law enforcement officers, disengaging from what we call non-criminal barricades, that's kind of a new thing for a lot of agencies. But legally speaking, liability speaking, and safety speaking, trying, with the goal of really rendering aid to that mentally ill person in crisis, that is oftentimes the very answer. Now, that causes controversy because police officers say, well, wait a minute, aren't we going to be liable? For instance, if that person turns homicidal, walks out the door and harms his neighbor, aren't we going to be liable? Aren't we going to get sued? And in California, there's actually specific answers to those questions. And we've developed some training that deals with that very narrow issue. And I think we're presenting it in a dynamic, kind of engaging way that everybody kind of tunes into. And so that's kind of some of those difficult problems and challenges that we're trying to solve, do our part to address in law enforcement.
Isn't that also similar to the topic about high-speed pursuits and when to disengage because of the danger to public safety?
That is, and thankfully we, as a profession, we got the message years ago about the high-speed pursuits and the risk-benefit analysis, thankfully, right? Because when I first started as a police officer, we had rather liberal pursuit policies, meaning we could chase a lot of stuff. And I'm trying to think if I've ever been involved in a pursuit that didn't end in a crash. Maybe one or two, and those are the ones that just clearly got away. And those are more recent where we, knew to disengage. But I would say 9 times out of 10, they ended in horrific crashes. The worst ones I've seen is when they crashed into an innocent person, right? Crash into an innocent person. I always think that could have been my family. That could have been, me. And what are we chasing this person for? Was the juice worth the squeeze? So that risk benefit analysis, that calculation that officers are doing now, just like in the vehicle pursuit scenario you mentioned, I think hopefully we're starting to apply that to a lot of things in law enforcement and really thinking, as law enforcement, there's no way we can be the world's problem solvers. There's just things that is too far entrenched. I think like drug addiction, mental illness. As an officer, do I really have the tools to fix that? Probably not, right? Regardless of how we think about it, nobly we should be fixing this. We need to start taking a really hard look at what is our limitations, right? And sometimes disengaging, not engaging, not going in, not trying to jump in to fix the problem may have to be the best answer. It's not a great answer. It's not we're not necessarily solving the issue, but it might be the best answer.
And Scott, what stage in someone's career would you say they could benefit from your courses? Is there a particular stage? Is it early, mid-career, or could be a wider range of anyone in law enforcement?
Yeah, we have a variety of classes, and I think each one maybe appeals to a different, tenure on. Our response tactics for critical incidents and in-progress crimes, that's a course I wouldn't recommend it to somebody fresh out of the academy. You're just trying to kind of get your bearings like any new guy in the job. But maybe once you got a year or two on, come see us, and that's going to start to make more sense. And certainly as you have that mid-year career, as you are preparing to become a supervisor or you are a supervisor, or you're working a special unit or something like that, this is definitely the course for you. Our other training courses, like our field training officer courses here in California, those are the officers that receive the recruit fresh out of the academy and spend a few months training them in their car. That's a real special position. And if you get selected for that or you're trying to get that, we want you to come to our course because, like I said, we're using expert instructors. And I like to tell people, the field training officer course that we use in California has to be 40 hours. That's a 5-day course. We don't use PowerPoint, not one PowerPoint slide. And people are shocked that, they have a heart attack when they hear that. That's impossible. Oh, it's possible. We just spend the whole time teaching and getting you as the student to teach. We don't use PowerPoint. So there's no death by PowerPoint.
So we're coming up here on our allotted time. Is there anything new on the horizon that you would like to talk about regarding your company, new courses, or any kind of things that you have planned?
Honestly, right now, what I'm I'm excited about two things. The first thing is collaborating, right? And using tools like LinkedIn and other ways that we collaborate, working with other. I'm kind of calling them copreneurs, other law enforcement officers that have these side businesses, or they're in training, or they've developed certain products and whatnot. I'm really tickled to be working with them, and so behind the scenes, it's nice meeting with them and trying to develop some ways to collaborate. And the single training class that I think I'm most excited about right now is this response to non-criminal barricades class. I think that's going to be a real game changer. And maybe I'm delusional, but I think it's going to save people's lives, both cops and the mentally ill people in crisis that we deal with. I think that learning when to engage, when to disengage, when to maybe walk away is going to be a game changer that I hope will save people's lives. So I'm excited about that because it's important.
And a few things I didn't mention either in your bio. One, you're a published author, so you've published several articles in law enforcement publications, but you're also a sought after speaker in industry. So if there's somebody out there who is at a company looking for a different angle, perspective on crisis management, you do custom training and speaking sessions, correct?
Yeah, and I think maybe the interesting or the value add about having somebody like me, this cop that's, does all this law enforcement training and crisis management, maybe the value there is a little bit outside perspective. It's not kind of the run of the mill person that maybe that's going to come talk to your company. So what I like to do if I'm going to be working with a company is kind of figure out, what are you trying to accomplish? And then how can I tell my story and use my examples and use kind of this behind the scenes look at what law enforcement does to add value to what you're trying to accomplish. And just like in law enforcement, we're constantly looking at other industries. Great example is the airline industry, right? Their use of checklists, their use of emergency procedures. We talk about that all the time, in law enforcement crisis response. So if somebody's out there that is looking for, a speaker to come talk that's not going to be dry, hopefully I'm present in a dynamic, animated or engaging way, and there's some way that I can add value, then be tickled to help.
And if somebody does want to book you, what's the best way to get in touch with you? Is it on your website?
Yeah, they can go to savagetraininggroup.com. There's a contact form there, and that's going to come right to me, or on LinkedIn. I'm constantly on LinkedIn, and I can't say enough about the collaborations that go on LinkedIn. So those are probably the two great areas to connect with me.
Okay. And I also noticed too, you have an eBook, the 5 golden rules of critical response that people can also get a complimentary copy of.
Yeah, if you go on savagetraininggroup.com, you can download this little ebook that's the golden rules of critical incident response, like you mentioned. And what that is I took the top 5 things that I think have shown to be successful, going back to the last 20 years of law enforcement experience. And I put them in a little ebook that you can take a look at. These are simple to understand concepts. These are just kind of the things that I think, man, if I had to teach you the top things I'd want you to know about critical incident response, dealing with crisis, these are the things. If you do these 5 things, you almost can't help but be successful. And they're not hard. A lot of them are real simple. And it's not state secret information. If you're not a cop and you want to go in there and download it, go ahead. It's not top secret stuff. And I think that there's some real value in those concepts.
Well, great. Well, Scott, thanks so much. I appreciate you sharing all of your deep knowledge on this topic of crisis management. I think for our audience, this is a very important topic. And I know from what we hear based on our feedback that we're getting, many more in HR and I think in the safety departments are thinking about how to plan ahead for some of these events. So I do appreciate it, and this is really beneficial. So thank you so much.
Rich, pleasure's been all mine. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Once again, that was Scott Savage, a Silicon Valley area police officer and founder of Savage Training Group, a company dedicated to providing law enforcement professionals the best possible training to advance their careers, become experts, and save lives. Please share this podcast with your family, friends, and coworkers, and help us raise awareness about the importance of planning for critical incidents. When lives are on the line, mere seconds count. Until next time, Please drive safely.
You've been listening to the Driving Safety Show. To stay up to date on the latest episodes, visit driversalert.com/driving-safety-podcast. There you can sign up for episode notifications, listen to past episodes, and even request to be a guest on the show. And don't forget, the Driving Safety Show is the show that features the movers and shakers who are working hard to make our roads safer. See you next time.